The river grass holds its breath as the flag lifts. October 1837. St. Augustine, Florida, a white square of truce against a salt sky, and the core question lands like surf against coquina walls. What is a promise worth when removal is already written into the future? Footsteps ring on stone inside the old Spanish fort, now called Fort Marion, and townspeople speak in lowered voices about a meeting outside the lines of battle. The air smells of lime dust and tide and rumor. Beyond the walls, the marsh lies silver under a pale sun, and runners slip along palmetto edges, carrying words not meant for ledgers. Every channel and hammock is a sentence in a language of ground. Men in blue study a map that flattens Florida into tidy ink and straight roads, while the country outside refuses to be flat. Water hides in grass, and the grass hides people who read the land better than any paper. In camps along pine ridges, women bank fires low and listen for hoofbeats and for the small, bright noises of children who must not be found. A pot of sofkey turns slowly, as if time were thickening with it. He moves where the ground gives gifts. In the hammocks, the shade is a shield, and the paths curl like smoke, and a name Osceola travels farther than any column can march. A messenger carries an invitation to talk, and the paper folds like a blade. In one world, the white flag is a shelter. In another, it is a tool. Rain smudges the horizon, and the wet scent of sawgrass rises. Somewhere, a drummer tests a quiet cadence, and an officer decides that honor can be managed. In the plaza, the cloth climbs the pole and stills. For a heartbeat, even the gulls hold silence, as if the sky itself is deciding which story it will tell. On the road to Fort Peyton, sand squeaks under boots and wheels, and the air is heavy with that particular tension that comes when words walk ahead of weapons. The meeting everyone has argued for is exactly where the fear has pointed. He steps forward with the ground in his favor and the past on his shoulders. If the flag means what it claims, the war can bend. If it does not, the stain will not wash out. The year turns back to the ink that started it. Paynes Landing, 1832, is read aloud by officials who call it consent, and by Seminole families who hear it as separation written in a stranger's hand. A small delegation rides west to inspect the promised country and returns with dust on their clothes and politics in their mouths, unsure whether a signature made on the road can bind those who stayed behind. At Fort King, a federal agent named Wiley Thompson carries the removal policy like a banner of law, and becomes a target that proves law can also be a weapon. In villages that edge pine flatwoods, the people call themselves Seminole, and call their kin by older names, and measure time by rains, and hunts, and songs that do not fit into ledgers. Among them stand Black Seminoles, who count risk with a colder arithmetic, weighing every rumor against the danger of being seized and carried back into bondage under cover of any future treaty. The country itself takes a side. Hammocks give shade and cover. Swamps teach patience. Coquina walls on the coast turn sunlight to powder and repel musket fire in ways maps never show. Osceola grows into a leader without a rank, a voice braided from land and grievance, not a general yet, the gravity that bends villages and fighters toward a plan. Another name gathers weight on the other side. Thomas Jessup arrives with logistics and promises and the firm belief that wars are won by rails of supply and boxes of paper as much as by volleys. The short timeline of attrition is simple and hard. Paynes Landing, 1832, sets the path west. Fort King, 1835, turns paper to blood. Dade Road, 1835, shatters a column among pines. Fort Peyton, 1837, will test the meaning of a white flag. Provisions tell a second story. Corn stores sink deep into sawgrass. Cattle slip into backwater islands. Gunpowder travels in gourds and sacks that look like nothing important to a hurried patrol. Along the old Spanish road, traders whisper more than they sell and learn to talk in two ledgers at once, one for the quartermaster and one for the people who will not be listed. The fort on the bay that the town now calls Fort Marion sits like a lesson in stone, an older empire's geometry now borrowed to house a newer empire's policy. In council circles, the elders stress continuance rather than triumph. Survivance becomes the quiet word that organizes every hard choice and gives shape to refusal. Messengers carry tobacco twists and short lines of speech. The message is always the same and always different. We will talk if talk respects the ground under our feet. Rains come early and fever rides the wet heat. Soldiers rotate in from the north with wool uniforms that drink sweat and boots that give up under the acids of the swamp. A preacher traveling with a column tells his journal that God favors order. A mother in a hammock camp tells her child that God is in the cypress knees and the heron that does not betray you. The treaty language claims the Seminole will be received as a part of the creek in the west, as if identity were a coat to be tried on in another season and kept if it fits. In the plazas of St. Augustine, merchants measure risk beside profit and decide that neutrality is a good policy until the army uses your warehouse for a depot and pays late. Osceola listens more than he speaks. He learns who can be trusted to carry words and who must be fed only silence. He learns when to appear and when to let rumor do the walking. An invitation to parley takes shape like a bridge of reeds, light, flexible, deceptive. It might carry weight for a few careful steps or sink the first person who believes in it. The cast is set and the ground is chosen. The next move will not be measured by ink or by oath alone, but by whether both sides mean the same thing when they raise the same white cloth. The roads in late 1837 are written in sand and rumor, and both are easily blown aside. Columns probe outward and return thinner, the swamp subtracting men by fever and misstep. At Fort King, the dispatches grow clipped. Scouts report smoke beyond the hammocks, then silence, then hoof sign that refuses to point in a single direction. A courier rides hard along the old Spanish trace with a letter that promises talk, the folds smell of ink and damp leather, and something like calculation. In the hammock shade, the leaders measure the letter the way hunters measure wind. They ask what the other side loses by promising a word that can be unspoken. A small party crosses a wet prairie at dawn, poles testing the ground before each step. Behind them, the sky spills cranes from the marsh like a slow white river. Rations run lean in the forts. Coffee stretches thin. Salt meat graze at the edges. The quartermaster writes more numbers and never once records the taste of the air. A settler road wavers near a cypress strand and ends where water begins to speak a different grammar. A sergeant calls it impassable. A boy calls it home. The first parley feeler is floated through intermediaries who can promise nothing but the chance to hear a second sentence. Everyone agrees to keep their hands where they can be seen. A storm bruises the afternoon and lays a curtain across the pine flats. Under that moving wall, scouts on both sides listen for the metal click that means a plan has failed. In St. Augustine, a painter tilts the canvas to catch a better light, not knowing he is saving a moment the nation will argue about longer than any of them will live. A patrol finds a camp circle still warm sofky scraping the pot's bottom footprints that become water the instant you try to count them. Another column follows cattle sign into the sawgrass and learns that cattle have more friends than soldiers do. The animals vanish into a whispering horizon. A captain writes that the enemy avoids decisive battle. A grandmother tells her grandchildren that wisdom is avoiding the moment your enemy wants. On a ridgeline of sugar sand, a runner delivers the word that certain officers are open to peace if the people agree to move west. No one can agree on which word is larger, peace or move. At dusk, a line of palmetto casts teeth shadows on the ground, and men on both sides sit with their backs to trees trying not to think about the white cloth that might be raised tomorrow. A lieutenant records in his book, "We met under a flag of truce and spoke of terms." The ground itself seemed to listen. The sentence will read clean on paper and carry grit in memory. In the town, merchants sweep their thresholds, as if sand can erase the sound of shackles in the stories the Black Seminoles tell when no officers are near. A drummer taps a cadence that belongs to European streets, while the swamp keeps its own time in the throats of frogs and nightbirds. The mismatch is the shape of the war. In a hammock, council elders say that a people must choose the ground of their words. If a promise cannot stand in the water and the heat, it cannot stand anywhere. The next message names a place to meet near Fort Peyton. The name tastes like stone and calculation. The white flag waits, folded thin as a blade. Voices carry more clearly than gunfire in the damp air. For a time, the talk is nothing but shapes of courtesy, like wooden cups passed hand to hand. Then the words lean forward. Remove west, lay down arms, accept reception as part of another nation. Each phrase is a net, and each net hides a hook. Silence drops like a curtain between two lines of men who do not share a definition for honor. The white flag flutters once like a breath sharpening before it breaks. The white flag rises again, and the air around Fort Peyton tightens, as if the pines themselves are listening for a verdict. Men step into the clearing by deliberate inches, and the distance between lines is measured not in yards, but in versions of honor. Osceola reads faces the way hunters read wind and notes which officer carries words and which one carries the decision already made. The ground is a quiet ally. Sugar sand takes prints, but not resolve. Palmetto walls the flanks, and a shallow run of water glints behind sawgrass like a thin mirror. On the army side, a file of dragoons sits their horses a little too square to be accidental. Their reins hang slack in that way that means ready. A surgeon stands back with a case under his arm and studies breath and color the way he has learned to study wounds. He is a tally meant for after. The first sentences are ritual soft and round. Terms and assurances and the idea that this meeting can save lives if both sides accept necessity. Osceola answers with land words rather than legal ones. He names water lines and hammocks and burial places and asks where those fit inside necessity. A clerk writes with quick strokes and never looks up. He is not recording a conversation, but fastening a sequence to the page. A courier rides in from the Fort Peyton road and gives a small nod to the colonel. It is the kind of nod that closes a door without touching it. The colonel turns the last courtesy into an order without changing his tone. Men step forward from the wings of the clearing like shadows gaining weight. Somewhere behind the palmetto, a bird startles and the whole clearing inhales. The white flag lifts one gentle inch as if to object. Osceola stands very still, because stillness is the last form of control left in the room. His eyes move once to the banner and back to the speaker. Hands that were empty a breath ago are not empty now. The choreography that was prudence becomes motion with edges. A captain recites phrases about necessity and prevention of further bloodshed. Each word is correct in his mouth and wrong in the air. Rifles angle down just enough to be legal and up just enough to be ready. The geometry of arrest is precise and practiced and very old. On the Seminole side, the elders say nothing. Their silence is a ledger of all the previous meetings where paper ate the truth. The ground remembers other ambushes. It does not care about uniforms. It cares about weight and the direction of that weight. When the move comes, it is clean and quick. A circle closes. The white flag wavers once like a hand that is not allowed to wave. There is no volley. There is no grand noise. Only the sound of boots and breath and the soft complaint of leather that means a choice has been taken. A young soldier looks at Osceola and expects a curse or a plea. He receives neither. He receives a steady look that will live behind his eyes. The painter in town will later search the face he has already sketched and try to decide whether dignity can be mixed like pigment. Shackles appear from a bag that was called medical supplies on a manifest. The metal is dull, so it will not flash in the accounts. Someone speaks the phrase, "under truce," and the phrase does not stop a single hand. Language has arrived at the edge of what it can do. The clearing empties by reverse order. Horses first, then foot, then the last glance of palmetto fronds, as if the plants wished to unsee what they saw. On the road, the column tightens. Scouts ride wide to discourage witnesses. The sun goes flatter, and the day begins to taste of salt from the eastern inlet. Fort Marion waits like a problem already solved. Its coquina teeth bite the shoreline, and its casemates smell of time and damp paper. In town, the news travels faster than the wagons. Merchants pretend neutrality, and then check which way the army books its bread. At the waterline, a skiff bangs softly against stone. A private stares at the horizon and tries to imagine where west begins. Night comes on like a decision. Lanterns draw small circles on the wall walk, and inside those circles men practice their forgettings. Behind closed shutters, a whisper passes among Black Seminoles about rescue or witness or both. Every plan begins with maybe and ends with risk. The white flag is taken down and folded and put away. It weighs the same as before and means less. A ledger receives the new numbers and leaves out the smell of tide and the sound the shackles made. Paper is lighter when it does not tell the whole. The wind changes and the river grass lies back down. The ground has chosen to keep its counsel. The story now moves inside stone. The casemate breathes damp and salt, and the first consequence is simple stone makes time longer. Inside names become numbers, and numbers become silence. Outside the walls, families adjust the map of safety by half miles, and moon phases moving camp when the gulls lift in a certain way from the flats. Law follows slowly, but it follows. Papers circulate that translate capture into procedure and procedure into transfer orders that smell of mildew and ink. In the council circles, survivance sharpens into daily practice. Elders pass on routes that avoid patrols, and mothers teach children to read water like a calendar. Soldiers rehearse night routines in the yard, counting keys, counting steps, counting the idea that order can mend what contempt has torn. A rumor of escape threads the town, and the marsh answers with a soft slap of oars after midnight, as if the water itself approves of sudden vanishings. A ledger tallies rations and transport while never counting the cost of a promise broken. It is the cheapest part of the whole enterprise. Columns ride farther south, their hooves chewing up sand, chasing footprints that end in water and stories that begin there. The Black Seminoles move in disciplined shadows, measuring each settlement for risk, each promise for teeth-building paths that run under the reach of slave catchers. On the legal page, the treaty's language sleeps in perfect print reception as part of another nation removal westward compensation abstracted into parcels and rations. On the ground, the language wakes up ugly. Graves are not clauses. Rivers are not signatures. Children do not hear the word reception and think of welcome. An officer writes that the war must be shortened by decisive action. The swamp writes back with fever and absence and long green distances. Merchants calculate neutrality until an army bill arrives late and heavy. Then neutrality becomes a hymn to cash and storage rates. A portrait leaves the fort and circulates as an image of authority over a man who cannot consent to the circulation. The nation develops a taste for owning faces. At night, a skiff glides under the guns, and the nervous voices above become part of the tide's rhythm. The stones keep their counsel, and the river keeps its secrets. New commanders arrive with new schedules that pretend time is loyal to plans. The country answers with lightning and ground that will not stay dry. In villages further inland, people bury seeds in high sand. A gamble against both water and soldiers, an act of faith that food can outrun war. A school in a distant town teaches that the treaty settled the matter. An elder in a hammock teaches that the matter is the ground beneath your feet and it is not settled. An anchor number creeps into congressional talk like a ghost of arithmetic. This war will cost upward of $20 million before the books close, and not a line item can buy back trust. Pursuit grows procedural. Scouts range in fans, dragoons test the edges, boats probe sloughs, and still the quarry becomes landscape whenever the wind changes. Some prisoners go north along the coast to another set of walls where salt and ceremony mingle. The transfers smooth the conscience of those who prefer distance to doubt. On the old Spanish road, a chaplain writes that necessary acts preserve life. A grandmother replies without ink that necessary for whom is the only honest question. Cattle trails fray like rope, and each frayed end becomes a family's boundary, a measure of how far you can live from soldiers and still find milk. In the towns, children play at raising a white cloth and arguing about who is allowed to speak under it. Their parents look away. The fort surgeon notes a fever and the exact hour it rises, because that is what surgeons can do. Outside, the wind shifts and the marsh smells of rain. A final order is drafted that will move the story from one wall to another and from one definition of policy to its last consequence. The paper dries. The seal presses down. The order moves him north along the coast, and the fort on the island receives him with the same stone neutrality as any other prisoner serf striking the wall like a clock. Officials record the transfer as a tidying of procedure and write that the climate may improve his condition, as if air could absolve intention. Visitors come to look through iron at a man made into a symbol and leave with pocket versions of certainty that fit their politics. A physician notes fever and the thin edge of breath and the formal words for a sickness that does not speak the language of policy. In town, sermons try to square the capture with honor and choose the path that hurts least to preach. The text does not mention flags. Far south, the war continues without the face that drew so much attention, proving that leaders can be taken and causes can still walk. Black Seminoles move with a discipline learned in danger, some toward alliances that promise a measure of autonomy, others toward horizons that do not recognize slave patrols. A clerk copies treaty lines again for a committee and adds columns for parcels and rations columns that cannot hold burial grounds or words for belonging. Another officer drafts a proclamation to offer terms and calculates that the price of mercy will be less than the price of months in the swamp. The painter finishes the portrait, and the nation mistakes likeness for understanding a comfort that lasts longer than the man did. January brings the kind of cold that travels across water and into lungs, and the physician writes a final hour with the same neat hand he used for temperatures. There is ceremony without peace, uniformed silence without consensus. The wall keeps secrets, and the surf carries them away in pieces. Afterwards, the debate over the truce hardens into two schools that cannot hear each other. Necessity spoken in a barracks, betrayal spoken in a council house. Appropriations grow while language shrinks, and the arithmetic of cost never once finds the line where trust could be repurchased. Markers rise on roads and in towns to state that a capture occurred and that a war continued, sentences compact enough to fit on metal. Generations later, the record is reread by eyes that belong to descendants and scholars, and the language of survivance begins to surface where the official script once lay flat. The bridge to now is not built from victory, but from endurance. The question set under the white flag walks forward with the people who outlived it. Today the wind crosses the river grass the same way, and the question under the white flag travels with it into classrooms and council houses. On Big Cypress and Brighton and Hollywood, the day begins with school buses and council meetings, proof that continuance is not an idea, but a schedule. Language lives in rooms where children repeat Miccosukee Creek words, after elders the vowels carrying a geography older than any road. At Atathiki, the museum doors open on cool archives and warm-breath photographs and beadwork and paper that remembers what stone tried to keep. Cattle move in fenced pastures under a sky that once hid columns, and the old skill of managing herds becomes a present-tense economy. Patchwork flashes in sunlight at festivals where drums keep time and the crowd hears not nostalgia but pulse. The Seminole tribe of Florida runs clinics and schools and business councils, sovereignty expressed in budgets and ballots as much as in song. Along Tamiami Trail, the Miccosukee language rises beside engines and airboats, a counter-rhythm to traffic that does not know the names of the water. A court docket in a distant city lists cases that concern land and jurisdiction, and the right to decide each line, a modern translation of older fights. Markers at Fort Marion and Fort Moultrie state what happened in sentences that fit on metal. Tours add the quieter sentence about the flag. Scholars read treaty text with students and teach them to ask who wrote it and who paid the cost when the ink dried. Family stories travel at kitchen tables where the year 1837 is not a number, but a breath held and released. A community event announces language night and fry bread and a talk on archives. The flyer is bright because the future is invited. A present-day snapshot is simple people at work. And school elders in circles, children learning names for birds and waters in words that fit their mouths. The echo returns to the white flag at St. Augustine and the clearing at Fort Peyton and asks again what a promise is worth when pressure names itself policy. The answer is not a sentence, but a life lived forward, survivance as practice, continuity as law, and the wind over the marsh refusing to forget.